Welcome to Politics and Psychology. Today we are discussing bootstraps, old money, and where it comes from. So, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps has become a political phrase, and it's often in the messaging of individuals and businesses that are considered old money. So, today we'll discuss the origins of the words bootstrap and old money. We'll also discuss who has old money and where their old money really comes from. So, what does the phrase pull yourself up by your bootstraps mean? The original use of this was in the late 1800s in a physics school book, and it was one of the sample test questions. And the question was, why cannot a man lift himself up by pulling on his bootstraps? The students were then supposed to practice and explain how, because of physics, it's impossible for a man to do, that a man cannot, with his weight, use shoestrings to pull himself up. So a few years later, in August of 1834, an inventor named Nimrod Murphy, he put an announcement in the Nashville Banner newspaper, and he claimed that he had discovered perpetual motion. And as newspapers often do, then they'll take one story and add it to make their story. So the next month, another newspaper called the Mobile Advertiser, they took Nimrod's story and they teased him about it. And they said, well, he probably succeeded in handing himself over the Cumberland River or a barnyard fence by the straps of his boots. So at that publication, people then started using the phrase as a sarcastic way to say that something was impossible to do. So fast forward to today, and the phrase that was meant to describe an impossible achievement somehow was changed to now refer to increasing your financial status, that it's possible if you would only pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So now, whenever someone tells others to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, it's implying that socioeconomic advancement is something that everyone should be able to do, even if it's difficult, but you're self-reliant and you pull yourself up and you can do it. In political messaging, political candidates and parties will state that everyone should be self-reliant and that the government should not give out any handouts. And even when Congress tries to increase taxes on the wealthy or decrease the burdens of the lower and middle class, it's the wealthier individuals and companies that complain that it's unfair to them because they achieved their success without any outside help, and therefore others should do the same. The loudest complaints are often from the individuals and the families that are associated with old money. So this is where the bootstraps and old money ties together. And it's either the individuals and families from old money or the businesses and corporations that we now know today that are wealthy because they began from old money. So what is old money? Old money is defined as the inherited wealth of established upper-class families. This includes the Kennedys. These are some more of the well-known names. The Kennedys, Rockefellers, the Ford family, and the Bush family. Think of Anheuser-Busch beers. But there are also old money families who are not as famous, and there's probably at least one or two inside your state and maybe inside your zip code. There are also a multitude of companies and corporations that were built on old money. These include universities, religious institutions, banks, insurance companies, and even newspapers. For example, Tiffany and Company, Harvard University, Princeton, J.P. Morgan. These are just a few of them. Now, the origins of old money are money that began a long time ago or in the beginning or the origins of our country. So if the individuals, families, and companies with old money are repeatedly telling others to be self-reliant and to pull themselves up by their bootstraps as their ancestors did when they first came to America, then we should be able to glean some important lessons on how they obtained their old money and how they obtained their success. And so we will start analyzing what their actions were, and we'll start with the universities. So Georgetown University was founded in the 1800s as Georgetown College. It was founded by Jesuit priests who were considered Maryland's Catholic elite. And it's important to know that they were elite because elite and old money always go together. But because these Jesuit priests were elite but didn't have enough money, then they were able to only build and expand on Georgetown through the use of selling slaves. So in 1828, the president of the college sold 272 enslaved persons to fund this new school. Some of the more famous universities that we know of are in our country called Ivy League, and they're regarded as prestigious because they were some of the oldest established colleges and universities in our country. So then how did these Ivy League colleges become established? We'll start with just a few. Princeton was founded in 1746, and until the Civil War began, between 15 and 40% of its revenue on any given year was from the use of or sale of slaves. Now, the university itself did not own any slaves, but it was able to fund the school and expand the school because the majority of all the school presidents, their trustees, and the faculty members were able to obtain their education and their wealth because they were slave owners or they had businesses that benefited from the slave trade. Princeton also, unfortunately, had a slave auction on its campus in 1766. Similarly, early financial donors to Brown and Harvard University, they also were able to donate because they had accumulated wealth from the slave trade, and they were specifically involved in transporting slave ships to and from Africa, as well as from their cotton plantations. It's interesting to note that Harvard is the first institution of higher learning in our country. It was founded in 1636, and although it was our first institution, it's one of the more premier ones that we consider when we think of a Ivy League school or an Ivy League school. Their first 150 years, it only grew because of the revenues that they generated from slavery. Yale University inherited a small slave plantation in Rhode Island, and from the slave labor and revenue produced from that plantation, they funded its first graduate programs and were able to give away their first scholarships. In fact, if we look at of the 9 Ivy League schools in America, all of them were financed through slavery. The only exception is Cornell University. It was founded in 1865, which was the same year that slavery was abolished. And that's the only Ivy League school that has no connection to slavery. So Ivy Leagues are associated with old money and elite class. However, this old money was obtained by the enslavement and exploitation of others. So the early generations of the students who attended these schools, they received preferential treatment once they graduated back then and now, just by saying, oh, I went to Harvard or I went to Yale or I went to Princeton. They are looked at as a more intelligent or a more elite person, or that their family is more elite and able to attend and afford those schools. However, because the early families, when America first began, they were able to attend these schools often for free from the scholarships produced by the work of slaves. Then when they got their preferential treatment for jobs, they were given high-profile positions and courtesy on financial loans. So when they were able to leverage this Ivy League education, get jobs and financial loans from that, then when they had children of their own, they were also obviously legacy children who were also able to go to those legacy schools or Ivy League schools. So when you have old money then being used to perpetuate money and to perpetuate positions and preferential treatment, then naturally, just human psychology and behavioral sociology, we're going to see that if we see you as elite, then we will regard you as elite and continue to give you favors as elite. When you repeat this preferential treatment from the 1600s to today, then the success, status, and wealth of the old money families that we know today are not because of the hard work that they did, not because of them pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, but because of the hard work and lives given by those they enslaved. And we're emphasizing this so that we can see that although it's easy to say that everyone should work hard and everyone should be self-reliant, that is true. But it's hypocritical to say that if you were only able to achieve your success because of not of the efforts of yourself, but because you exploited and enslaved others, and it was their hard work upon which you were able to stand. So now let's look at the slavery and old money connection. Just from reviewing the history so far, we can see that slavery was indeed the foundation upon which the wealth of many old families in America, if not America itself, was built. And that's because slavery afforded some white families, I want to say some, not all, some white families the ability to accrue tremendous wealth by relying upon the work and the sale of enslaved persons. In 1860, for example, over $3 billion was the value assigned to the physical bodies of enslaved blacks used as free labor and production. These billions were more money than all the money combined that America spent in our factories and railroads during that beginning time. In 1861, the value placed on cotton produced by enslaved blacks was $250 million. So slavery enriched white slave owners and their descendants, and therefore formed the old money foundation that you may see today. So if you're able to accrue millions to billions of dollars, then you can't spend that all on yourself. You can't spend it in 1 or 10 lifetimes. And that's how old money is created and then passed down from generation to generation. Many of our political officials today in our current political environment will often cry that it's unfair to take from the wealthy people who do have old money or have earned their wealth from other means, but to take their wealth and give it to the lower income or the poor. And they often cite that America is the land of opportunity and that others should also be self-reliant as themselves and achieve wealth as they did, and they could do it for their own families if they just put in the work. But this too is hypocritical, and it's not true, because the majority of these persons and families did not pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They were not self-reliant, but they did rely on the poor and the enslaved who were powerless to accumulate their own wealth, and they were oppressed and prevented from even being able to have a business or even being able to read. So listening to arguments about what's fair, on the surface, it may seem a good message to promote self-reliance, but let's look at the background of the individuals who are saying it and then further consider opportunities for equity to truly balance out what has been achieved by dishonorable means to achieve wealth. And then how can we honorably introduce ways to make it where not blaming anyone for the past, but also recognizing because of the past, some individuals have been able to achieve wealth and even old money passed down from generation to generation. And then a large group of other individuals have been able to pass down generational poverty. So it's not actually in the current arguments politically that we are taking from the rich to give to the poor, but in actuality, it's taking from the poor from generations past with the effect impacting us today, and taking from the poor to then make others rich in the past and in the present. For example, prior to the Civil War, the slave economy in the Mississippi Valley produced more millionaires than any other state or area in the United States. That's because, of course, there was a higher concentration of slave plantations there. In 1870, 5 years after the Civil War ended, there were about 4 million slaves who were freed, and because of that freeing, our country experienced the largest wealth shock in American history. And the reported wealth loss of Southerners dropped by $4.3 billion, which is 65% of their income from a decade earlier. This equals 2/3 of the wealth in the South being erased because the slaves were freed. However, because these families had already accumulated so much wealth, and again, they had their elite status and they had social prestige, they were able to capitalize on their status to then still get loans to get land and to still get preferential treatment to buy more land. You also saw where some of the savvy plantation owners or former plantation owners were able to marry other individuals who also were former slave owners and had a semblance of social prestige and elite status and land. So when those generations from those unions had children, they were able to amass larger plots of land and then perpetuate their wealth. And because they had this wealth, money is power, and money creates opportunities that you would not otherwise have access to. And so because they were able to have access to these opportunities, these led to even more and higher opportunities. And that's how old money families are allowed to stay or maintain their elite status. But let's look at an actual example of how this may play out. This is an old money legacy example. So the Lowell's family is an old money wealthy family in Massachusetts. This is a real family, by the way. They were a large financial donor to the early Harvard University, and they obtained their wealth from slavery cotton plantations. In the Museum of Old Newbury, which is in Massachusetts, then the Lowell's family is credited as having, quote, realized the promise of America as the land of opportunity by uniting Puritan values of hard work, community service, and individual responsibility. However, the Lowells and the historical writers of this and similar old money families, they consistently leave out the truth. It's not that these old money families, like the Lowells or others, again, not all, but many, they didn't really engage in any hard work or any individual responsibility to achieve this quote unquote promise of America, but instead they exploited others. And that has to be acknowledged when you're considering messaging about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps when you yourself did not do it, or you benefited from a family that you may not even ever met, but you had to acknowledge that you did benefit from the family that you came into that did exploit others, and therefore you did have a head start or you had a huge advantage through preferential treatment. So back to the Lowells as an example, then let's look at a few of how their descendants were able to prosper. You might have heard of T.S. Eliot, the poet, Tennessee Williams, a playwright, Dick Cheney, our ex-vice president of the United States, McGeorge Bundy, who was a former national security advisor to Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. These are all descendants of that one Lowell family. So this is an example of how wealth obviously brings power and opportunity, and you're able to make huge influence in our political realm, in our society, and communities because of the wealth that you have. But you cannot then say again that you achieved your wealth by your own self-reliance, that your generations, that your family has worked hard to achieve their wealth. Because T.S. Eliot, Dick Cheney, great guy, all of these people were able to come from this one family and have such high success and high profile, not only because of their efforts, it was their efforts, but they were able to have that kickstart jump advantage because of the preferential treatment, because of the wealth obtained from the hard work of others. Another example is the Chew family, and they are in Philadelphia. And again, these are real families. The Chew family was one of the largest slave-holding families in Pennsylvania, and the patriarch was Benjamin Chew, and he was one of the most powerful and wealthy men in Philadelphia in the 1700s. And some historical accounts praise the Chew family as having wealth coming from real estate and for them being icons of commercial and business success. However, they fail to mention that the real estate was actually slave plantations, and that was where their wealth came from, that they then used to buy other land or start other businesses. When we look at the theme of old money, Benjamin Chew was in the 1700s, and the last known relative who did not have children died in 1989. So that's almost 300 years of old money that had been passed down for multiple generations. So whether it's the Chu family, the Lowells, the Rockefellers, Kennedys, etc., whenever you think of a family having so much wealth that it lasts for centuries, they are going to be considered one of our socially elite, and they would be given special treatment because money is power and money can buy a lot of different things. Money is also influence, especially in the political realm. And for that reason, that's why the majority of our United States presidents are descendants of old money. In addition to this old money, just being from it, this old money from these presidents was obtained through slavery. There are 13 United States presidents who did own slaves while they were in office, and 2 additional presidents brought slaves with them when they took office or during their presidency. This is also the reason why President Joe Biden and every living former U.S. president, except for Donald Trump, is a direct descendant of slave holders. This includes former presidents Jimmy Carter, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, who had a white mother. So what we're seeing is that not only does old money from slavery create a position where money can last for hundreds of years, for generations, it also can tie you to access to power, even including being the President of the United States. Old money was also used to establish businesses, with many of these businesses that started back then growing into the famous corporations that we know even today. So here's a list of a few of these old money founded businesses, again with this old money being founded by slavery-based revenue. Aetna. Aetna is our country's largest health insurer, and they insured the lives of slaves during the 1850s, and they reimbursed slave owners when their slaves died. AIG, which is the American International Group, they purchased American General Financial, which owns U.S. Life Insurance Company, and it was the U.S. life insurance that also insured the lives of slaves. So basically, slave owners, they viewed their slaves as property and as essential to their revenue. So then they would insure the slaves. So when the slaves died, they would then collect money on that slave's death because they believed that they lost money from that slave, which indeed they did, which is part of the basis of this whole conversation. So Bank of America. During its early years, it was known as Boatman's Savings Institution, Southern Bank of St. Louis, and also Bank of Metropolis. They accepted slaves as collateral on loans. Brooks Brothers, interestingly enough, they're known for their nice suits, but they started by making clothes for slaves and selling those slave clothes to slave owners. J.P. Morgan Chase and Company, between 1831 and 1865, 2 of their predecessors, known as Citizens Bank and Canal Bank in Louisiana, they accepted approximately 13,000 slaves as collateral for their loans, and they seized approximately 1,250 slaves when those plantation owners defaulted on those loans. Lehman Brothers is a financial services empire, and they did recently acknowledge that their founding partners owned slaves and sold slaves during the Civil War era. They also added that they, quote unquote, profited significantly from slavery, and then they did issue an apology because of that. But I thought it was commendable for them to recognize that their existence was only because of the significant profits from slavery. New York Life. New York Life's predecessor was Nautilus Insurance Company, and they sold slaveholder policies during the mid-1800s, with 339 of the company's first 1,000 policies being written on insuring the lives of slaves. Norfolk Southern Railroad. Mobil and Girard and the Central of Georgia were the 2 companies that became part of Norfolk Southern. Mobil and Girard would pay slave owners $180 to rent their slaves to help build the railroad for a year, and the Central of Georgia just owned several slaves. Tiffany and Company, surprisingly, was originally financed with profits from a Connecticut cotton mill with that cotton being picked by slaves. And then Wachovia, now owned by Wells Fargo. This was part of the two institutions that became Wachovia Bank, the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company and the Bank of Charleston. These two companies owned slaves as well as accepted slaves as collateral, again, for loans and for mortgaged property. So not only were these institutions able to become what we know today and to become long-lasting and iconic in some industries because of their longevity, but also their longevity was built upon the backs and the lives of slaves. So those are some of the most famous corporations that did benefit from old money. And the main reason we are detailing these historical facts is that many of the individuals and corporations that did obtain this old money, primarily from their reliance on slaves, are often the same individuals and the same companies who are lobbying against the laws, against the tax practices, against student loan waivers and equity programs, with their main argument being that everyone should just pull themselves up by bootstraps and not rely on any government, quote unquote, handouts. But this also highlights the hypocrisy, because just like it's impossible to actually pull yourself up by shoestrings, it's also impossible that these old money families and corporations actually did any hard work on their own without having exploited and enslaved others. So we're not saying they didn't do any work, but they had a strong foundation and a huge jumpstart because of their involvement in slavery. Now let's look at our country as a whole. Despite our country having a less than honorable start, we still live in a country that many individuals around the world would love to live in, and they would love to have our lifestyle, and they would also love to be able to have the power that the American government has. Unfortunately, however, not only has America's economy and capitalist society lifestyle been built on the slave economy, but it was also involved in the exploitation of other countries. One example is Haiti. In 1914, the United States invaded Haiti, and using our military force of the Navy and the Marines, we stole Haitian gold worth millions of dollars in today's money. But this wasn't our first exploitation of Haiti. In 1856, Congress passed the Guano Islands Act of 1856. Guano is bird droppings, but because they accumulated for centuries, it's called Haitian white gold. And it's white gold because of the value, meaning that this guano was a very powerful fertilizer that Americans were able to use in the lands that they had depleted with their crops to then help refertilize their land and then, of course, produce more crops. With the Guano Islands Act, our Congress authorized American business owners to go to Haiti and to take any guano from any quote-unquote unclaimed islands near Haiti. And it was our United States Navy that used force to stop the Haitians from claiming any of these so-called unclaimed lands. And when Haiti did try to protest, the nation sent warships to this area to hold it in place, and also to tell them and warn them to stand down or they would be killed, which many of them were. This is what was called the white gold invasion of Haiti. Then we had a gold invasion. In December 1914, on December 17th, 1914, President Wilson sent our United States Marines to Haiti under the claim that he was helping to protect Haitians from possible German invasions and to protect our interests as a country in Haiti. But it was really just a plot to take custody of Haiti's gold reserve. When this gold was brought back to our country, it was then used to create and finance First National City Bank in America, which is now only known as Citibank. So despite Citibank having this as their history, Citibank has never acknowledged this, nor have they acknowledged that their wealth was obtained by invading and stealing from Haiti. They also have not paid Haiti back for any of what they owe to the Haitians. And unsurprisingly, in 2023, they were ordered to pay, Citibank was ordered to pay $25.9 million for intentionally and illegally discriminating against credit card applicants that the bank identified based off of their last name as being Armenian or Armenian American. Throughout American's history, we can see that modern American capitalism was made possible by the profitability of enslavement. And in our country's earlier days, slave owners in the Upper South, they profited because they received cash for the money for the people that they sold. Slave owners in the Lower South profited because they purchased people and then they were forced to work in unkind or cruel conditions such as cotton fields and sugar fields. In the North, the merchants who supplied clothing and food to the slave traders, they profited, and so did the ship owners who transported captives to America and the railroads that built the railroads from slave labor. In the North also, people profited by investing in the banks that handled the exchange of the money for slaves, or in the insurance companies that provided insurance policies on slaves, and also provided slave and plantation owners loans, and they earned the interest off of those loans based off of their expected profits from the enslavement of people for their plantations. So it's not by accident, nor is it by self-reliance, that the largest banks in our country were founded upon the use of and selling of slaves. The number one is J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in our country, holding over $3.38 trillion in assets. Bank of America, the second largest with over $2.45 trillion in assets. Wells Fargo, the third largest, holding over $1.7 trillion in assets. And Citibank is the fourth with $1.68 trillion in assets. So in our time today, I hope you were able to see that the advantages of having been a slave owner or benefited from the slave trade, they produced benefits that still exist today, so much so that even decades and centuries later, you're able to see that their power and wealth and elite status have been maintained. And it's impossible to separate that these present-day advantages were obtained because of past exploitations. Bootstraps. If you pulled on them, it would obviously be physically impossible to get yourself over a fence. And that was the whole point of the sarcastic phrase being used to show that it's impossible to pull yourself up by yourself and by your own weight. But the many individuals, the wealthy families, the politicians, and the long-standing businesses who promote this message of self-reliance, they are making the message as if they themselves were self-reliant, but they are refusing to acknowledge that they relied on the work of and sale of enslaved persons, and that the foundation of much of their family's success and their current wealth was because of slavery. They're also failing to acknowledge that many of the benefits and preferential treatment that they received, they want to hold on to, but prevent others from also receiving any type of preferential treatment or consideration. For example, right now there's a huge debate over the forgiveness of student loans, and individuals who did benefit from legacy admissions or from old money admissions or from giving a donation to a school and therefore getting into the school for preferential treatment, they're disregarding that as preferential treatment in the current history of our country. In our past history of the country, they're also failing to acknowledge that many of their ancestors and forefathers only obtained this elite status because they received free scholarships or free tuition to what we now know as Ivy League schools, and they were only able to receive that free tuition and scholarships because the Jesuit schools, for example, at Georgetown, had unpaid labor from Jesuit-owned slaves on their plantations in Maryland that they used to fund that education for those students. Yale, similarly, they owned a plantation and they used the profits from that slave plantation to fund its first graduate programs and to give away its first scholarships. So we cannot say that it's un-American to help individuals when our country is founded on not individuals helping voluntarily, but being oppressed and forced to be the foundation upon which many others were able to achieve their wealth. And our goal was to just understand the hypocrisy in much of the language happening in society that has become divisive. But if we just took an honest look at how wealth has been obtained and how it was able to become amassed in a way that was unequitable and oppressive, it might give us more compassion to see that maybe more can be done rather than looking at individuals who may need that same type of consideration or preferential treatment just for the achievement of equity, not as a handout, but just for a compassionate understanding of balancing that much of our economy was not based on hard work, nor was it based on equality or equity, but it was based on oppression. So if we can at least try to correct some of those instances of oppression in the generational poverty that has ensued, then it's not giving a handout, it's not taking away from the rich, but it's just creating opportunity where we can have a true America and a true economy that provides opportunities for all to exceed, not only those who obtain a huge lead or a head start by oppressing others. So that ends our time today. And although, like with last time, it was a sensitive topic, the goal is to not be afraid to have uncomfortable conversations, because once we do, then we can move forward and truly become a great country where there is freedom for all, as well as equal opportunity for all. So as always, thank you for listening. I really, really appreciate it. And please continue this conversation. And despite the controversial nature, please continue the conversation using science and love. Walk the path of light. And if you run